I am very pleased to welcome you all to today's Sustainability Essentials webinar. I am Susan Ingalls, a Direct Sustainable Furnishings Counsel, and I'm delighted to have with us here today Sam Hall of Duke University, who is studying the environmental toxins. She is studying the health and in human health and environmental health effects on such chemicals as the PFAS chemicals. And so we are delighted to have you with us here today, Sam. We are delighted to have everybody in our audience with us. We do have all the audience on mute, but we want to hear from you with your questions and comments. So as you have questions and comments, please put them into the question box, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. And after the presentation, we will turn our attention to those questions and make sure we get an answer for each one. So to start with, I am going to give you all an introduction to Sustainable Furnishings Council. We are in our 15th year now, and we are a coalition of companies that are involved in the residential furnishings industry in various ways. So Sustainable Furnishings Council members include suppliers of materials, manufacturers of all kinds of furnishings products, stores where these things are sold, interior designers who are specifying furnishings products, and importantly, environmental organizations, both World Wildlife Fund and Rainforest Alliance, and a co-founder of the U.S. Green Building Council helped get us started 15 years ago and remain active with us today. When we started, our first job was to determine what are best practices for sustainability, then to set standards for recognizing exemplary implementation of those practices, and then to start educating and to start building markets. So we are pleased to continue all of that work now. We are an educational organization more than anything else, and we serve more than our 400 member companies through the Sustainable Furnishings Education Fund. We have programming that serves the entire industry and the general public. There are about 400 Sustainable Furnishings Council member companies now. If your company is not a member, we invite you to join. We provide our members with guidance and resources and special educational programming, networking opportunities, and marketing support. We do a lot of educating, including with Green Leaders, our 6-hour 6 CEU course that gives an overview of sustainability issues related to our industry, lots of information about questions to ask, answers to look for when you're specifying product or processes or materials. And it also includes information about what consumers are thinking and very helpful advice on how to use all the information we share with you to build your business and do your job better. So if you're interested in the kind of thing we're talking about today, I suggest you might be interested in Green Leaders as well. As you all probably all know, sustainability is an umbrella term. There are many, many issues that fall under this wide umbrella of sustainability. We at Sustainable Furnishings Council tend to worry about all of them, and we tend to put our attention where we believe we can have the biggest impact the most immediately. So that is in addressing emissions for one thing, and in addressing harmful chemical inputs in another thing. our industry is related to the range of sustainability issues. We are a global manufacturing industry, so emitting a lot of carbon dioxide as we burn electricity in our factories and as we transport materials and goods around the world. We use a lot of wood, and so have a large responsibility for halting deforestation, which is so important because our forests are crucial to our effectively addressing the climate crisis. And in our forests live many of those species that are going extinct so quickly. Our industry tends to use a lot of hazardous chemicals like other industries, but we put a finish on everything. We use a lot of glue. We use a lot of additives like the PFAS chemicals we're going to be talking about today, and flame retardants and others. So this handful is of great concern to us, especially when it results in toxins being released into our environments, as happens often in textile production and also often in leather production. So both those things you want to manage carefully to reduce the amount of pollution that results. That pollution that does result sometimes often especially adversely affects the people who are working around the chemicals that are being used, for instance, in cotton production, which is also, cotton is being cultivated with forced labor. So social equity is a big issue there. Finally, we throw away an awful lot of furniture. And when that furniture has harmful chemicals in it, those harmful chemicals are concentrated in our landfills, and that can further compromise our hope for sustaining a healthy future. So there are lots of ways in which our industry is related to sustainability issues. We recognize that it can be overwhelming. So we think of sustainability in this wheel of 6 different aspects of sustainability. This graphic loaned to us by our friends at Parsons, the New School. In the health and wellness area, we have our concern for the harmful chemicals that are most commonly found in furnishings, which, as I said, include VOCs like formaldehyde, flame retardant chemicals, the PFAS chemicals that we're going to be talking about today, antimicrobials, and our most common plastic, PVC. These are found in lots of places in our furniture, those VOCs and finishes and adhesives more than anything else, the PFAS in performance fabrics more than anything else, where we also find antimicrobials, but they're also in our mattresses. The flame retardants are in upholstery foam and often in fabric. And PVC is hidden in many places, including performance fabrics also. So our What's It Made Of initiative is to raise awareness specifically about this handful of harmful chemicals. It consists of a pledge to simply ask, what's it made of, when you are having conversations with your vendors, and to help you get good answers to those questions. It also consists of a supply chain questionnaire that we have on the What's It Made Of page at our website. On that page, you can take the pledge to ask what's it made of, and you can also access the survey. It's in SurveyMonkey, and our hope is that you will use it in SurveyMonkey because that's useful for us. You don't have to tell us who you are, but when you use the questionnaire in SurveyMonkey, it helps us know what companies have responded with information about what their products and materials are made of. This is important for helping to sustain a healthy future, but it's also important for building your business because consumers care. We have been doing consumer research since 2008, and what we see this year is that 97% of the furnishings consumers believe hazardous indoor air quality is an issue, and fully 34% of them see themselves and their families directly affected. So it is something that we as industry professionals, as perhaps especially as interior designers, need to be able to respond to and address with our clients. So Sam, I am delighted you're here with us. With this, I want to welcome Sam Hall, who is studying environmental toxicology at Duke University with the goal of improving both human and environmental health. And her research is that she'll be sharing with us today is about PFAS, but she also is working in this laboratory that does a lot of work on flame retardants. So with this, Sam, I am so glad that you are with us. You do have the ability to advance your slides now if you like, and I can advance them for you if you like. So thank you for being here.
Perfect. Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. I am Sam Hall. I am a PhD student at Duke studying environmental health, and I've done a bit in the past on flame retardants, but for now my doctoral research is completely focused on PFAS chemicals. And today I'm going to be talking about our study on PFAS chemicals in house dust. So just to introduce you to, sorry.
There we go.
Just to introduce, perfect. So just to introduce you to what are PFAS, in case you're not familiar, PFAS are per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. You'll also hear it referred to as PFCs for perfluorinated chemicals. That's a bit of an older, outdated term. PFAS is the preferred term now. And you'll also hear them called forever chemicals. This is because PFAS are very persistent. The carbon-fluorine bonds within these PFAS are very strong. So they don't break down, and as a result, they're very persistent in the body and in the environment. And there's lots of PFAS now. There's about 5,000 different PFAS chemicals. Some estimate that even higher, around 8,000 to 9,000. So PFAS is a huge group of chemicals. To get a little further into what a PFAS looks like, you can see here that these black carbon atoms here, that's the alkyl part of this group. And it's surrounded by all of these fluorine atoms here in green. That's what we mean by these polyfluoroalkyl substances. And then at the other end, there's usually some other sort of functional group, like in this case, this carboxylic acid. And so this chemistry of this hydrophobic tail and this hydrophilic head, it leads it to having these great properties of being water resistant, grease resistant, and stain resistant. So this right here is just the example of PFOA. PFOA is the one that you'll hear about the most. It's also called C8, and that is the one of most concern for a lot of people. And as a result of this water and grease and stain resistance, PFAS have been put into a lot of different products. So whether that's stain and water resistant treatments, so the fluorinated stain treatments, waterproof apparel, lots of different kinds of textiles and carpetings, anything that needs waterproofing or grease proofing, such as food packaging. So takeout containers and fast food will also have PFAS on them. Firefighting foam is another source of PFAS, especially at airports and military sites, because PFAS are used in firefighting foam. It's really great at battling grease and fuel fires. And so because PFAS are in so many different products, we are concerned about PFAS exposure. So the CDC estimates that 95 to 90% of the US population has PFAS chemicals in their blood. And there's many different routes of exposure to PFAS. So you can get PFAS through your diet, through eating, through the food packaging that your food is on. Drinking water is also a source of PFAS exposure. And today we're going to be talking about dust exposure. So ingesting dust from your household, in some cases dermal exposure to dust. So that is also a way that we can get PFAS into us. And the reason that we're concerned about PFAS being in so many products and we're concerned about PFAS exposure is that PFAS have been linked to many different health effects. So certain kinds of cancer, certain reproductive outcomes, decreased immune response to vaccines. All of these are different health effects that we are concerned about, especially given that there's so many different PFAS and that there's so many PFAS that last a long time, that they're very persistent and don't go away. So I'm going to talk today about the study we did in homes and fire stations. Basically what we did is we went to the main living area of these homes. So that would be the living room, wherever they spent the majority of their time. And we vacuumed the dust in that area. Getting that dust from the vacuum, we then analyzed those dust samples for PFAS chemicals. So we certainly didn't look at all PFAS chemicals because there's over 5,000 of them, but we looked at a lot of the perfluoroalkyl acids and some fluorotelomere alcohols and some of the DIPAPs. And so we did these from 184 homes in North Carolina, and you can see in the corner the citation for the paper. It is published, so you're welcome to go and look at that if you want more details. So here are some of the results that we found. So we found that house dust contained several different PFAS. So on the left over here, these are the legacy perfluoroalkyl acids. These are the most stable. These are the ones that you hear talked about the most in terms of their persistence and toxicity. So PFAS, PFOA, PFHXS. And then on the right, you have the PFAA precursors. So these are more volatile. These are less persistent, maybe less stable, but they're a concern because these can transform into these other perfluoroalkyl acids. So what we found is that homes had PFAA levels around between 1 to 1,000 nanograms per gram, and then the precursors were at much higher levels. So we found those in the house dust at levels between 1 to 100,000 nanograms per gram. One interesting result is that the majority of the PFAS in this dust was these FTOS chemicals. So these are fluorotelomere alcohols. You can see the fire station living areas and the house living areas were pretty similar in that both of them had the majority of those PFAS were the FTOs. So we have 6,2 FTO and 8,2 FTO. Those are just two different fluorotelomere alcohols in the house dust. And so just to segue, what are these FTOs? So FTOs can be found in high levels, especially in the waterproofing agents used on carpeting and textiles. And again, they're very similar. So you can see here, this is the 6,2 FTO. You can see how similar it looks to the PFOA. And we're concerned because all of these FTOs can then later on, eventually, whether in the home or out in the environment, can break down into more toxic, persistent PFAS. One thing that we also looked at was if we could see a difference between houses with carpeting and houses without carpeting. So you can see on the left are the homes in the fire stations that had more carpeting, and then the right in the gray is the ones that had less or no carpeting. And it was really striking to see that if there was more carpeting in the home or in the fire station, there was more FTOs in the dust. So that was something that we kept seeing. That was one of the strongest results that we had. Our other results on square footage or the age of the house didn't matter as much as carpeting in this instance. Another thing that we found, oh, sorry, how do I go back?
There, I'll help you get to the previous one. Is this the one you want to be on, Sam?
Yes. Sorry about that. Another thing that we found was that if we compare our study to previous studies on PFAS in dust, you can see this marked decline in PFOA, PFAS, and PFHXS in the dust, which is really encouraging news because PFOA and PFAS have been phased out of a lot of different products. And we can see that reflected in the dust, that as that transition takes place, you see less PFAS in the indoor dust. So that's why we think that we see this decline is because of the voluntary phase out of those particular chemicals. However, that's not the case for necessarily all PFAS. So in this next slide here, you can see that if we compare our study to a study done in 2008, you can see that while all of the PFAAs have decreased, this 8.2 FTO has actually increased quite a bit from 2008. So that 2008 study actually got samples in 2000 and 2001 compared to our samples that we got in 2014 and 2016. So you can see that there's a pretty dramatic increase in the FTO concentration. So given that we have all this information about PFAS in dust, what are others doing about PFAS? So here's just a small sample of some of the companies that have said that they were going to be addressing PFAS in their products. So you can see Lowe's, Home Depot, IKEA, Target. A lot of them have stated that they were going to be phasing out or removing PFAS in certain products. So in their carpets, in their rugs, or removing the intentionally added PFAS from their products. In some cases, people can still detect PFAS in their products, even if they're not intentionally adding it. But a first step would be to not purposefully add more PFAS to their products. And so aside from removing PFAS in the product, there are some other alternatives. So in the case of food packaging, so food packaging, again, needs that grease-proof liner, especially for like paper products. And these two companies, Solinus and Zume, actually created a manufacturing process to create a PFAS-free molded fiber food packaging that they've shared. So they're using a different process to get that grease-proof lining without using PFAS. Another company is Keen Footwear, that they have transitioned to a alternative non-PFC waterproofing technology for their shoes. And I'm not necessarily endorsing these products or these processes as the best way to do it. There's just some different options for replacing PFAS with a different technology. One thing to note is that replacing the PFAS may not result in a similar product. It may be less effective in terms of waterproofing or less effective in terms of stain proofing, but that is a different conversation. So what are the conclusions that we found from our study? We found that we can certainly detect several different PFAS in indoor house dust samples. In our particular dust samples, we found that the FTOs were at higher concentrations than other PFAS, but we can certainly detect other PFAS of concern like PFOS and PFOA. While some PFAS house dust concentrations have been declining over the past few decades, we do see the FTOs that have been increasing in house dust. And some considerations when considering removing or replacing PFOA and PFOS is what other kinds of PFAS are present or are added. So I talked a lot today about the FTOs, but there's also other precursors. We looked at dye pads as well, but there's thousands of other PFAS chemicals to think about, and especially think about whether those precursors could be transforming into those more persistent PFAS and it's more toxic PFAS. So with that, I would like to acknowledge all of my coworkers at Duke, all of my collaborators, all of our funding sources, and all of the participants who provided samples from their homes or their fire stations for this study. And if you have further questions, you can definitely reach out today during the chat, or you can feel free to email me at sam.hall@duke.edu.
Great. Thank you, Sam. Thank you. This is so interesting. And I am, of course, not a chemist, I've learned, I've never heard of the FTOs until today. But I did know that there are many of different specific chemicals in this large class of chemicals. So it's interesting to know about that particular one. I wonder if you can talk, we've got questions from others, but I'm going to start by asking you two questions that have occurred to me. Can you talk about exposure levels? Is that part of what you and your colleagues are studying? Like how much of this stuff makes us house sick?
Ooh, we didn't do that in our study, but certainly others are looking into that, especially for exposures to, say, children who are on the floor being exposed to the dust, of how much of that that they could get. Certainly dust exposure isn't as prominent as, say, like water exposure. So if you're drinking water that is contaminated with PFAS, that would be a more concerning route of exposure. Generally, the PFAS in our bodies, we suspect, is mostly due to diet. So the food, the food packaging, and the water that you're consuming. But dust is a route of exposure. It may not be as prominent as the diet and the water exposure, but.
And in the water exposure from water, am I right that it's not just the water I drink out of the tap, but it's also the water that is in the vegetables that I'm eating, because that has come from the groundwater that's polluted? Is that right?
That is a question that people are actively addressing. So food, like crops, can uptake PFAS from soil. So other issues are that PFAS are in surface water, they're in groundwater, they're in soil, they're in biosolids that get applied to agricultural fields. So it is a circular movement of PFAS throughout our environment. So certain crops do uptake some amount of PFAS, probably not a ton that I know of, but that is a potential route of exposure as well.
Yeah, good. And so these chemicals are in many things, not just in our furniture, but since they're known to be linked to harm to human health and other life on the planet, it's a good thing for us to limit our exposure as best we can. So here is a question. Let's see. One designer, the first question we have is from a designer. These are results from my client's Duke University test. How do we advise the general population going forward, and how do we remediate the proliferation of flame retardant chemicals in a pre-2013 upholstered product? Here are the results she quotes here. Results: ID product Manupenta FM550. Can you see this, Sam? It is so, it is such chemistry language that I can hardly say it all. But ID product Manu-Penta FM550, FM600, TCPP, TDCPP, TBPP, ITP, MPP, V6.
So I can't see that particular question. I don't see the Q&A box.
I have to read it to you. But it came from a sofa from a major manufacturer.
Right. Well, so that would be flame retardants. So flame retardants and PFAS are two different things. Flame retardants are certainly added to upholstery as well. I can't speak to your specific results necessarily. What was the question?
So the question is, how do we remediate the proliferation of flame retardant chemicals, she's saying, and how do we advise the general population going forward?
So the general recommendation I would give is to just try to not buy furniture that has added flame retardants in it, to reduce your exposure to some of those chemicals. I think for the most part, especially say like a baby product, you don't need to be adding flame retardants to that product, and so you can choose to find products that don't have that in it.
Great. And Sam, you do have, or you have had at Duke in the lab where you work, the ability to receive samples of foam for testing. Is that program still going on, Sam?
I believe so. That is our Duke Superfund foam project, where you send in a sample of your foam and they'll return it back with the results of the different levels of flame retardants in those foam samples.
Good, thank you. And the results they'll get is sort of like what we just read from this one designer's client. Good. Okay, great.
Exactly. I can find the website and send that to you to send.
Great. We'll make sure that we get that too. Thanks.
That's only flame retardants. We aren't currently doing that for PFAS chemicals.
Not for PFAS. Okay, great. Next question. What is causing the increase in 8,2 FTOs, you call them, FTOHSs?
Let's see. Can we go back to back a few slides, please?
Yes.
We'll get back to the. There we go. So we're not. Oh, the next one.
Up. Like that.
The increase over time. Oh, sure.
That's over time. This is it, right?
It's fine. The F82 FTO, we're not really quite sure like why it would be increasing over time. I believe it is because that there's been a transition in how these are being manufactured. So this fluorotelomere technology has taken over, I believe, around 2013. So I think that is why we're seeing that increase in these FTOs. I guess I should mention that FTOs are used as like a raw ingredient in this manufacturing process. So it's not necessarily that they are supposed to be in the product necessarily, that we do see them at so high levels. But it could be residual FTOs from the manufacturing process instead of something that's been purposely added. But I do believe that's the reason that we're seeing it here now, and we didn't see that back in, say, 2000. It's because that manufacturing process has changed to be this fluorotelomere process. That's a similar thing as well with the firefighting foams, that has switched off as well into different processes as well.
Interesting. Next question, can you speak to the work of the Green Science Policy Institute on this issue?
Let's see, I think they are working, I'm trying to think what I recently read from them. I know they are encouraging people to look at their supply chains, to look at what PFAS are being used, especially with the EPA wanting to know what kinds of PFAS have been used over the past 10 years in different sorts of products, and what have been emitted, what are being used and disposed. So I think that the Green Science Policy Institute has been working on getting information to different manufacturing groups as far as informing them about PFAS, and certainly asking them what they can do, or what a manufacturer company can do to get PFAS out of their products. So what are the different alternatives? Again, like those companies I mentioned, removing PFAS from their products. I think that that is what I know of, but
Yeah.
I'm sure Green Science Policy Institute's doing more.
Yeah, good. And of course, the Green Science Policy Institute has this website called sixclasses.org, sixclasses.org, that has information in a way that lay people can understand it, and also references to much more technical information. So that is a resource I will recommend. Next question. Go ahead,
Sorry,
Sam.
with resources as well, there's also PFAS Central. The more technical one is ITRC. ITRC also has accessible information for people that a lot of states are using it to inform their policies and legislation. So ITRC and PFAS Central are also good resources.
Excellent. What does ITRC stand for?
Interstate Technical and Regulatory something. Sorry.
Commission, maybe.
I think
Yeah.
probably commission.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Given that the EPA is asking manufacturers to be aware of PFAS they might have used over the course, or they have used over the course of the last 10 years. Does your research show that, I'm interested in the length of persistence of these chemicals. We know that C8 chemistry is what gave it the name Forever Chemicals. We know that there's been a voluntary move to C6 and C4, shorter chains. How persistent are those shorter chains, and do you think 10 years is a good idea, given what you have learned in these dust studies and what you know about water?
Well, think of the half-lives of these chemicals in humans. So here you can see PFAS and PFOA. Those have half-lives of years, but so does PFHX6. I believe the half-life of PFHX6, the C6 sulfonic acid, I think its half-life in the body is 6 to 8 years. So even longer than PFOA and PFAS. Certainly PFHXA has a shorter half-life in the body. But even if these shorter chain chemicals are less persistent, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're less toxic, especially for being exposed to them day in, day out. If we're continued to be exposed to them, that doesn't preclude health effects, even if they don't necessarily bioaccumulate in the body. Especially given how persistent they are. Once they're out in the environment, they don't transform, they don't degrade. It's going to be a hassle to figure out how to clean these up and how to remediate sites. That'll be the next question, because we don't really know how to deal with these chemicals. So we can filter them out of our water, but after that, then what do we do with the filters that are contaminated with these PFAS chemicals? So that doesn't solve the issue. So using short chain PFAS doesn't solve that issue of having PFAS that stick around forever. So I don't necessarily think that the solution is to move to shorter chain chemicals, but certainly the decline in PFOA and PFAS is encouraging. So definitely getting rid of those chemicals and moving to something different. But whether we're moving to the shorter chain or moving to these fluoroether compounds, which are essentially the same thing, just with an oxygen stuck in the middle, moving to those, I'm not quite sure if that'll be advisable, especially since people are trying to regulate PFAS as a class. So regulating that whole group of 5,000 of these similar chemicals that have similar effects in terms of their toxicity.
Yeah, good. So on this, on the regulation, I will mention now that the EPA comment period about their rule has been extended until the 27th of September. So those of us who are concerned have an opportunity to make a comment before the 27th of September, and you can do that on the EPA website. Let's talk a tiny bit about bioaccumulation. So these are persistent chemicals, they bioaccumulate. And again, thinking of it just as a person, not as in no scientific way, but am I doing the right thing to think, okay, it's accumulating in fatty tissue. And so here is a little residue from the sofa I have in my house, and here's a little residue from the popcorn box from the movies, and here is one thing after another, and it accumulates in the body. And when there is and I know this isn't specifically what you're studying, but when there's enough concentration is when it makes us sick. Is that right, Sam? Is that what we mean by the concept of bioaccumulation?
Right. Yeah, so something like the flame retardants or some of these other more persistent organic pollutants that are more lipophilic definitely do bioaccumulate in the fat. And you're correct that there are thresholds, certainly, of chemicals where it's not a concern until you reach a certain point. PFAS are interesting because they're not the typical persistent organic pollutant. They aren't as lipophilic as some of those other POPs.
Yeah.
So they don't necessarily accumulate in the fat necessarily. They more partition to, say, different proteins in the blood. So it is an interesting scientific question for PFAS as far as the mechanism of how they're causing toxicity, how they're causing all these different health effects. But you're right that there are different levels of exposure. Certainly, people who are more highly exposed, like the group in West Virginia from that movie, Dark Waters, Mark Ruffalo, those people were exposed to a lot more PFAS in their water. And that is kind of how we know this information about the different health effects of Philip in particular. But yes, we're not quite sure as far as bioaccumulation, as far as how that ties into PFAS, how well the PFAS in your blood levels correlates to the different health effects that we see.
Yeah.
We don't yet know that.
Okay, great, thank you. Next question is about filters. If PFAS are part of the dust, can it be mitigated through air conditioning with filters or with vacuuming with special filters, a special, a HEPA vacuum cleaner or something?
I would say the vacuum cleaner, absolutely, that if you remove the dust, you are also going to remove the PFAS in that dust as well. I'm not quite sure about AC filters. That's an interesting question. I guess if the filter, I would expect would remove some of it because it is removing some of the dust, but I'm not quite sure. Vacuuming anything that can remove the dust should work to remove some of that PFAS.
Good. And a related question is about air purifiers in the home. We're putting air purifiers in our homes because of COVID. Is this effective in eliminating PFAS in our home? Is the filter going to catch it and then we change the filter and we've got less of the stuff in the house?
I think with water filters, water filtration with reverse osmosis works really well. I don't think air purifiers, I can't think of any reason why some of these PFAS would be removed necessarily. Especially the more volatile ones.
Yes.
Like those FTOs.
Yeah. Okay.
So I can't recommend any particular like air filter to remove PFAS.
Okay, but it is a good question to ask the air filter companies as we're shopping for air filters, perhaps.
No, that's absolutely a great question to research.
Yeah. Next question, have you explored the use of PFAS in indoor paint as a contributor to its prevalence in dust?
Ooh, I have not. I mean, I have seen that PFAS can be found in paint, but I never thought about it being a source to the dust. I attributed a lot of the dust to the carpeting, to stain proofing, to anything like furniture that had a textile on it. But paint could be a source.
Yeah. So maybe next time you're vacuuming houses, you'll vacuum the walls. We'll see what happens. Yeah. People are appreciating the resources we've mentioned and asking for them. And this is recorded. And so the recording will be on our YouTube, and people can use that to access more resources. But the resources that we've mentioned are 6 classes and PFAS Central and ITRC. So we'll make sure that those are easily found on our website too. Let's see if there are any other questions here. And I think maybe we've gotten to all of them. One thing I will say is moving to this slide about what others are doing about PFAS. You know, there are ways of achieving some performance without any fluorinated stain treatments, and that, like IKEA and Target, are using polypropylenes, for instance, and that is not as stain resistant, but it is an alternative. And also, wool is a very good, for our audience of interior designers, I think wool is a good performance fabric to consider, because wool is naturally stain resistant. The lanolin in the wool is naturally stain resistant, and so that could be a good choice for many of you who are choosing fabrics for design projects. And I will also mention washing, that linen, for instance, is very, very washable. And if you just make your interiors more washable, that will reduce the need for being able to spill with impunity. You know, washability is another solution there. Okay, we do have a couple of other questions that have come in. And one is, can we read labels? And I suppose that this is related to the emerging rule at the EPA. You know, now that we do have a label that we can look at on a piece of furniture to see if they're flame retardant chemicals, that the time might come that we would look at a label for PFAS, but that doesn't exist at this time.
No, not to my knowledge. I have seen products that will claim to be PFOA free, though that doesn't necessarily mean that it's PFAS free.
Yeah.
So
good
that is
point.
the closest thing, but I haven't seen any. There's not a demand. There's not. You don't have to have a label that says whether there's PFAS or not.
Yeah. Okay. That is not required at this time. And if you request a manufacturer's data sheet, safety data sheet, since these chemicals are perfectly legal, they may or may not show up on that. But I think that asking what's it made of and using this supply chain questionnaire that we've got on the website can help you have better conversations with your vendors. So I do recommend doing that. And I further recommend to those of you who are a member of our organization, we do have these working groups in each of these 6 areas. And the health and wellness working group talks about things like the questions they're asking and the answers they're getting. So if you're not a member, you're invited to join. And when you join, you can be part of the working group discussions, which are tremendously useful and in real practical ways for industry professionals. So let's see, I think that's all the questions we got, Sam. Thank you so much for all you have shared with us. Really, thank you very much for the research you and your colleagues are doing. We, as a layperson, I know that my environment is causing harm to my health and to other life, and I don't really know how to address it. And you and your colleagues are doing work that will bring answers. So thank you very, very much for that.
Oh, thank you for inviting me, and thank you everyone for the great questions.
Yeah, lots of good questions. And so Sam, thank you too for making yourself available. I'll make sure everybody has had time to get your email address. And we will look forward to staying in touch with you, Sam, and finding out what comes out of the lab next. So thank you very much. And I hope that our audience will join us again next month. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, everybody. Bye now.
Bye.